So it's 101. I'm Jeff Cyphers, chair of CC Power, and I'll call the meeting to order. And I believe I've verified we have a quorum. Is that correct?
Correct. There is a quorum present.
Thank you. And I haven't been informed of any matters subsequent to posting the agenda. So our first item is to call for any public comment, and a reminder that any member of the public can address the board on any matters that are not on the agenda on this item. I'm not seeing members of the public here at the moment. So I think that moves us into our consent agenda. I just want to confirm we're okay, right? The webinar is letting in the public, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So let's move on to the consent agenda. And there are two items here: the minutes of the March 20 board meeting and the staff report on CC Power member procurement policies. And does anybody wish to remove an item or have any kind of short question on anything before we ask for a motion on this? Not seeing hands raised. So is there any public comment on the consent agenda?
I'm seeing Monica's hand raised, Jeff.
Oh, Director Padilla.
Wait, okay, first of all, this is my first meeting, and I've got a new monitor and I'm having a hard time finding things, but the policies and responsibilities or roles, is that on the regular agenda or on?
That's on the regular agenda. So that's item 6B.
Got it.
And
No
so,
questions then. No
okay.
questions.
All right, super. So again, just one more call. Is there any public comment on item 5, the consent agenda? And just a reminder, this is the minutes from March 20 and the staff report on CC Power member procurement policies. I'm not seeing any hands raised. And just a reminder for folks, the raise hand feature, at least on my screen, is at the bottom of my window. I'm sure everybody's Zoom platform is different, but that's how we're doing this. So is there a motion for adopting the consent agenda?
So moved.
I heard 3CE
Second.
and Peninsula.
I can second.
Thank you. So let's do a roll on the consent.
Okay. For the consent agenda, Ava Community Energy absent. Central Coast Community Energy.
Yes.
Clean Power SF.
Yes.
Peninsula Clean Energy.
Yes.
Redwood Coast Energy Authority is absent. San Jose Clean Energy.
Yes.
Silicon Valley Clean Energy.
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power Authority.
Yes.
And Valley Clean Energy.
Yes.
Thank you. The consent agenda passes.
Thank you. That moves us to our regular calendar. So we're going to begin with a few reports from the general manager. So why don't you take it away, Mr. Morris?
All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining and happy April to everybody. I have the GM update today, so we're going to go through a bunch of quick updates, and then we'll have a slower, hopefully discussion around the upcoming work plan or proposed work plan and a related early cut of the budget. So in the GM updates today, there are no decision items. But there's a lot of information and we do want to have opportunities for discussion, particularly on the proposed budget. So you'll be teed up for that as well. So let me start just by saying thanks. Great to see everyone. For those of you who attended the Cal CCA conference, and it's an exciting time for CC Power. So it feels like similar to the CCAs, there's a element of rounding the corner, and you'll see in the work plan and budget, there's a expanded scope and good opportunities and a clearer sense of how we're going to deliver value in the coming year. To start though, we'll just get through a couple quick business items. So on the next slide, we have some financials. These are designed to be shared with you. These are unaudited, but our accountant does provide a financial rack-up on our performance for the year quarterly. So looking at 3 quarters of the year, July 1st to March, you see that it's a little hard to digest, but we're basically on track. So here are the financials, and then on the next slide, we've done a little assessment for you, and what it shows is revenues are on track. We're on track on the spending in a bunch of areas, personnel and other operational expenses, travel and events, and then we may be outperforming against plan. And what that really means is we haven't used as much of the money as we had originally envisioned. So that's professional services where we're bringing in support for various strategic assessments, et cetera. And then also on managing the contracts, we called that contract admin flow throughs. So that's where we had budgeted money to make sure we were effectively managing it, but we haven't had to spend as much. And then lastly, on the reserves, we have invoiced for the reserves. So essentially we have the reserves. So financially, it's looking very on track, and I think everything's coming together. And we'll try to also add more of a year-end forecast in the future so people can know where we expect to land by the end of the year, which ultimately is probably more meaningful than how we're doing mid-year. So feel free to jump in with any questions if you have them, and I'll keep moving along. Next slide. I also wanted to report out on general manager activity. One contract was signed. It was a relatively small contract, $525 a month for with a company called BizHaven. What they do is HR advisory services. We can cancel anytime. And so what they've done is they've set me up with an advisor who's helping develop our HR handbook and making sure we're compliant. They're also providing standard language in case we want to add any language into our documents or job descriptions. And then lastly, any posters we want to post, et cetera. So even though CC Power is small, this is one of the sort of structural setup ideas we want to get done so that we're ready to grow and compliant, especially if we exceed 5 staff, which is when a lot of the HR requirements or more HR requirements would start to kick in.
GM Morris, this is Jeff Cypers. I just wanted to ask, as we begin to scale and think about, these kind of reports being, about more people and more dollars, do we yet have a policy about the disclosure of contracts as a magnitude element? I'm thinking that 3 years from now, you probably don't want to have to bring very tiny contracts to the board, but I like that you're doing it now. So
Yes.
I'm thinking, if we don't have that kind of a policy, maybe tag that on to a future business item as having a threshold where there's a disclosure or something like that.
I appreciate that, Director Cyphers. Thank you. That's noted, and I'll work with General Counsel Isles on formulating an approach that makes sense. We have erred on the side of excessive transparency in the interest of helping everybody settle in, but I hear you that some things may look small. Yeah.
Good call.
Okay. And one other update, and then I'd like to welcome our Director of Origination, Philippe Gerritsen, to join me here in providing updates. So on the next slide is a little bit on offshore wind. So we haven't checked in with you on offshore wind for a bit. As many of you recall, last summer, a resolution was passed that directed us to take strategic actions towards offshore wind, again, potentially leading to an eventual RFO. A few of those actions were to look at our possible scale to see if we could be a relevant buyer for offshore wind. We've done some of that, and to continue to collaborate with industry entities, including potential project developers on offshore wind, so we could understand it better and look at that. We also had contemplated a couple different strategies for how CCAs who might be interested in offshore wind would pursue that. The standard approach would be an RFO or an RFP, but we also had talked about working and sort of trying to find ways to get a demo or some tool like that activated. So to that end, we've signed a memorandum of understanding with an offshore wind project developer that by offshore wind standards is very small. It's called CODEMO or CODEMO, and it has to do with a 4-turbine floating offshore wind project off the Vandenberg Space Force Base coast. This is close to the Chumash, or may be in the Chumash posed Ocean Preservation District. So what this MOU does is it helps us work with at least one offshore wind developer to collaborate, to understand their costs better, to look at the viability of their project, to talk about barriers, and then may end up leading us further down the path of a solicitation for offshore wind. There's a couple things I wanted to note about CODEMO though. Whereas most of the offshore wind projects off the coast of California are 20 miles out and would involve many turbines to the tune of hundreds of megawatts, The Cottimo project is a 4-turbine project proposed about 5 miles off the coast. It's still floating, and the turbines it uses are existing turbines, whereas the other projects tend to be planning around future larger turbines that, as far as I know, don't exist yet. So one of the strategies with Cottimo, if that's a path we end up going down and wanting to go down, which would of course come to the board, the idea here is that this might be a helpful leadership approach for California, where you're activating some critical parts of the offshore wind supply chain. You're looking at how to permit it in state waters, which is something that all projects would have to go through. You're navigating some of the interconnection challenges with it, and also going through the siting of it. So there's a lot of benefits to looking at this project as a way to get started on offshore wind. And while it may, in the grand scheme of things, not be a massive project, it still has a lot of benefits that we see. So this MOU just formalizes our intent to collaborate with them. And I just want to also emphasize, this is not signing a contract with offshore wind in any way. This is an MOU to talk further and collaborate with them. So I'd like to welcome Philippe Gerritsen, our Director of Origination, to make any additional remarks on this. And then Philippe's also going to take us through the next agenda item, which is the Build Transfer Agreement Phase 2A update. Philippe, thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, General Manager Morris. I think you've covered most of what I was going to share here, so appreciate that. The only other thing I would add is that with this memorandum of understanding, we're really looking to develop a partnership with the Cottimo project so that we can best understand what key learnings there are in the development of offshore wind and how we might be able to support additional projects getting developed in California and put a seat at the table for load serving entities to shape how we can make sure that these types of projects get built right, so that ultimately we're taking into account the different stakeholders and finding that balance of local investment comparative against the cost of offtake, so that we can get valuable renewable energy and capacity benefits delivered from within the state.
And are you open to taking questions as you go, or would you like to save them to the end?
Let's take them as we go, please. Director
Okay.
Hale. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious as to what we can share, what you can share about the difference in permitting requirements associated with how far offshore the project is proposed to be. How does it change the permitting process?
Sure.
If
Philippe,
you know.
you want to take that, or you want me to?
I'm happy to take a first stab at it, and if you want to add anything, feel free. So this is in state waters, so it's not subject to the same federal permitting requirements as if these projects were being developed within any of the BOEM lease auction areas. So the expectation is that this will enable the Cottimo project to get developed in a more rapid manner, thus positioning it to be a potential pilot project and demonstrate how offshore wind may be developed in California and on the West Coast. There's still all the same diligence and everything that any other project within California would have to go through. But ultimately, this allows this type of project to then demonstrate significant learnings and give us insights into how we can best support the further build out of the much larger scale projects that are currently contemplated in offshore lease areas.
Thank you.
And before I go to Director Padilla, do you know yet, or could you bring to a future meeting, who the lead agencies would be for permitting this project?
I would have to get the specifics
Yeah.
in discussion with Cottimo.
Yeah, I can speak to that. It'll be the Coastal Commission, and then also the on-land agencies. So one of the challenges, just to recap for Director Hale, is, in a federal lease area, you would have federal permitting, then you go state waters, then you have to get it onto shore. So then you have the sort of blend of the Coastal Commission, then onto shore CEQA with the Probably Energy Commission. So it's quite complicated. And one of the perhaps oversimplified strategies we're looking at here is this is sort of just shrinking the number of permitting agencies. Now, we think that might be helpful, but we don't actually know till it's really further vetted and Gantt charted out really how much time that saves you or if there are synergies in the larger federal permitting process. We know the federal side is looking at comprehensive permitting approaches, and I'm sure the state is looking at it as well. So those are ideas there. Thank you.
Okay. Let's go to Director Padilla.
Yeah, thank you. I think this is an interesting concept. I'm curious to learn like what would be or what could be the state's, whether it's CWR, the Central Procurement Entity, or the CEC, role in kind of helping us define what that building it right might look like. Is there opportunities, are there opportunities for some grant funding, since it'll be a demo project, I think you called it, or help in facilitating the permitting process or the viability assessment? So is there an opportunity for partnership with those agencies through this MOU?
Yeah, one of the unique attributes with us being a joint powers authority that we'd like to help in the contribution towards this project is that we may be able to apply for certain sorts of federal or state funding opportunities that may not be otherwise available to CODIMO acting on their own or to other private entities. We do believe that there may be funding available from the California Energy Commission. To your direct question, there might be also opportunities from the Department of Energy to support these types of projects. Maybe opportunities for loan guarantees or other development funding as well that can be at lower cost of capital than what CODIMO might be able to secure on its own. So as we move forward with this MOU, our plan is to engage in those discussions with CODIMO to understand what has been explored thus far, what incremental opportunities we might be able to bring forward to the table, and how we can best support the acquisition of those types of support mechanisms and incentives to position this California demo CODIMO project as a pilot opportunity from which significant learnings can be achieved.
Thank you. I'm not seeing other hand up from directors now. So why don't you go ahead and continue, and we'll loop back.
Okay, next slide. Philippe, please take it away.
All right. So if we move to the next slide, I can give a brief update on where we stand with the build transfer project. So we have now secured or have selected the vendors with whom we will work. We've selected Latham & Watkins as our build transfer counsel. They'll be putting together our pro forma agreements. We'll be vetting those contracts with our members to ensure that we take into account any feedback and specific contract language that our members would want to see incorporated into that. We'll also have the Energy Authority serving as our solicitation vendor. So they will be responsible for the organization and management of the solicitation, posting a website, facilitating the review of all of the bids that we receive, and doing a quantitative valuation on the bids so that we can then come up with a ordered rank list of the projects and do a qualitative analysis to determine how we might evaluate certain projects in merit order. We also have selected Dash Clean Energy and Panorama Energy Partners as joint owners engineers. They provided a joint proposal to us. And so they have extensive development experience and will be able to do the due diligence on the projects that we get submitted to us that look to be the most economic, which we will provide a small subset of the total offers to them for detailed review to help us inform which projects are the most viable that we ultimately would wish to move forward with in negotiations, at which point we would then look to do a deeper dive diligence and may select another owner's engineer to go into much more technical diligence at that point. So the next steps that we have here over about the next month or so are to negotiate the contracts with these various vendors and put them into place so that we can kick off activities to move forward the overall project. We are already in the development process of our pro forma PPAs and tolling agreements in parallel to the development that will take place with the build transfer agreements. These PPAs and tolling agreements will be for the procurement of the wind and geothermal contracts, as well as standalone storage and solar plus storage projects that may compete against the proposed build transfer projects that we would like to solicit for. And in parallel, we're also setting up sub-team meetings with finance members from each of your CCAs so that we can start going through the process of doing diligence as far as what implications there might be on your existing debt arrangements, so that we can best understand how to position ourselves for successful bond issuance and minimizing the cost of capital when we do go out to issue bonds for the purchase of a project down the road.
I'm
So-
seeing a hand up. Is this a good place to take a question, Philippe?
Yeah, I think
So let's
That
go to
works.
Director Hale.
Thank you. I'm looking at the language here about development of pro forma PPAs. And I'm recognizing that the build transfer aspect of this is the new part. And we already have authority to sign pro forma PPAs that CC Power had developed for our prior project participation. I'm wondering if you're imagining that the development of the pro forma PPAs would be focused on the build transfer aspect, and the balance of the PPA would be largely the same as was already developed. Can you give me a sense of how broad a scope are you thinking for the development of this pro forma?
so. The pro forma PPAs and tolling agreements are based upon the existing agreement structures that we've used for the geothermal and the long duration storage contracts that we have, and other pro formas that many of you use that have been developed and are managed by Keys and Fox, who is supporting our PPA development and negotiation process. The build transfer agreements will be materially different agreements from the existing PPAs and tolling arrangements, as they are more akin to EPC and M&A transaction documents. So we'll be getting those developed based upon the expertise that Latham & Watkins can provide. And we've already provided some guidance to Latham & Watkins as to what specific technologies we're interested in procuring, and whether there are specific types of resources that we are more interested in procuring, so that they can hone in exactly like what that form of agreement would look like.
So I just need to ask a follow-up, if I may, Chair.
Of course.
I'm really trying to get a sense of how much additional approvals I will need to get in order to be a partner. And I'm trying to understand your answer. I think you said that the pro forma agreements we've used for long duration storage and geothermal will be the PPA will be the language. And there'll
Yes.
be a separate agreement for the build transfer component. Did I understand that correctly?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and Director Hale, if I may jump in for just a second. We want to validate that the ownership path is economically rational. So we want to get bids from parties offering PPAs and compare them against the BTA. The PPA agreements we have, we need to dust off and tune up a little bit to allow different technologies than what was originally solicited for. So we might have phrased that as tuning up the standard PPAs we use. But hopefully they're still close enough to the original, just with different technology being solicited, that it's going to map 1-to-1 generally. The BTA agreement, as indicated, will be new though for everybody, and we're hoping that we land on a template that all the members can use. So we expect a fair bit of input and gyration as we tune up that first of its kind agreement for CC Power.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Philippe.
And I think if I can read between the lines, I think all of us would appreciate as much heads up on a new authorization structure so that we have time to do our own due diligence and legal review as possible. So I think that's true for all of us. Thank you.
Yeah, and I might just add, we've established sub-teams to specifically review the build transfer agreement and provide input on it that are independent from the teams that are reviewing the overall solicitation and valuation approach and then the bond financing. So we are managing this closely with your staff in order to ensure that there are ample opportunities for input and feedback as we move forward with this project as a whole.
I really appreciate that. And also, I think it's good to give as much warning to the board as possible. So both things matter.
Absolutely.
I'll turn to Director Padilla. Go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. So I'm assuming that you'll include these pro formas in the solicitation, and they'll be the best thing that we can do in terms of getting something out. But there's still going to be a lot of opportunity, and I'm assuming a lot of negotiation, if we do in fact find a developer who's interested in pursuing this with us. And so does your process allow for that as well, assuming that we'll put something out, but it's going to be modified quite significantly?
Yeah, the expectation is that we're putting together a pro forma that is then used for the developers to bid to, but is not a final pro forma that we would execute. There would then be negotiations between us and the developers. We anticipate shortlisting 1 or 2 projects for those detailed negotiations, and we'll be approaching the board for their budget approvals to move forward in those detailed negotiations, as well as further technical diligence on the projects to ensure that we understand any and all risks that may be exposed in the development process and can incorporate those considerations into our negotiations as we move forward and with those developers to kind of bolster our position in the event that our technical diligence identifies anything that we want to protect against. So I guess one clarification that I would like is whether the board expects to approve a template pro forma agreement or solely approve the decision to move forward with the negotiation phase and then later the actual execution of negotiated agreements with the developers. So I guess the short question is, does the board need to approve the pro forma that we put out to the solicitation for bidding?
I think in the absence of having a concrete proposal before us, it might be best to think about bringing both. And in the future, the answer, and I'm speaking as one person on our board. So if there are other board members with different views, I invite them. But I think because we haven't looked at this as a concrete proposal with a document to read, I think it's safest to bring both and assume that that's the process this time. But I think in future, if you want to bring to the board something that says substantially in the form of, and then authorize some discretion to staff and have some guardrails around what that discretion is, I at least personally would be open to that. I think it's hard for me personally to suggest a one-step process without knowing what it is. So I'll share that. Is there any differing views from the board? Director Hale.
I don't know that my view is different, but just to give a little more flavor to what at least I am facing, you know, anything that's brought to the board that we are asked to vote on, you know, we can vote on that, but it would not be binding on my agency until my board approves it. And actually, I do a 2-step. I do a commission approval, and then the Board of Supervisors approval would be likely for a project like this coming out of this effort. So I agree, Director Cyphers, that engagement early, you know, with some latitude would be helpful. But at the end of the day, you know, I'll have to bring the intended to be executed version through my commission and Board of Supervisor approval process.
Yeah, and that's understood that for negotiated agreements that are planned for execution, that was the anticipated route that would be required. We had not anticipated that we would need to bring the pro forma agreement to the board prior to dissemination for bidding from the vendors, from the development community. So,
Well, I want to test that because I spoke up as one member of the board, and I'm more interested in the awareness of that than the decision-making authority. And to Barb's point, to Director Hale's point, we were just at Cal CCA. We're very casual, so I'll try to be formal. The ultimate decision matters most. And so I think I just want to acknowledge that I was a bit freewheeling in the moment. And I think if staff feel that lowers the opportunity for being expedient and opportunistic, I think we could revisit that first stage. The last stage is critical because we do need board authorization. And so I'll turn to Director Padilla now.
Yeah, I was just basically going to say almost the same thing that you said, Director Cyphers, that I don't think, from my perspective, it's necessary or even prudent to bring a pro forma to the board and to discuss that pro forma in public. I think it's, created. We have kind of provided some guidelines already around what we want in a negotiation, and let the staff take care of it and then come back with something hopefully we can accept.
So I'll withdraw my earlier comment. I think I've seen the wisdom of that. So thanks. And GM Morris.
Just wanted to quickly offer for everyone that in line with what Director Padilla was saying, when we solicit to the market, they need to have some sense of how we're going to be contracting, because it helps them design their response. So what our procurement director Philippe is doing is sort of trying to get a sense of that initial document. But as Director Padilla said, there's going to be a lot of negotiation down the road if and when we move forward. We would categorize that as phase 2B. So right now what we're doing is trying to signal to the market roughly the skeleton of how we want to contract around this, so they know and can put a fair bid together.
So I think that's why you've got access to our procurement staff now, right? So you can get that intel. And then this is kind of a preamble to item 6B, because having access to some of our data will be critical for you to understand that, but we can reserve that for the next item. So, okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead and finish this up. Looks like we don't have hands at the moment.
all right, thank you. We'll move to the next slide, please. So as far as our current target schedule, we're looking to get these vendors under contract by the end of April, early May at the latest. Latham & Watkins has indicated that they wouldn't need much time, about a week, to put together the pro forma first draft of the bill transfer, but we are allocating about 6 weeks to get input from your teams to inform the final pro forma agreement, so that we would have that completed in like the June timeframe. Once that pro forma is set, that's probably the longest lead item for us to be able to launch the solicitation. So we're targeting that we would do that in late June. If we needed to bring the pro forma agreement to the board for approval, that would probably delay things by about a month or so on this overall schedule. The current plan is that we would offer about 8 weeks from the launch for developers to provide us with offers. So we'd be looking like mid to late August for those offers, and then we would have TEA do the valuation and qualitative analysis on the projects and come up with a merit order for us to evaluate. We would look at which selection of projects we would then provide to Dash Clean Energy and Panorama for technical diligence. That may be composed of both BTA offers as well as PPA retolling agreement offers, but we would primarily need the diligence for informing our selection of the BTA offers, considering the different risk profile associated with those resources. So the ultimate goal is to then have shortlisting completed, where we can provide a recommendation to the board around the October or November timeframe to move forward with selections, at which point we would move into the phase 2B, where we would commence negotiations and do a much deeper dive technical analysis on the selected projects that we would want to move forward with for BTA. Any questions?
Director Shaw.
Thank you, Chair Cyphers. Philippe, it sounds like you're structured around a design build project delivery system as opposed to any other project delivery, and you would have all permitting and siting and everything tied into the build transfer agreement. Is that the intended approach there?
Yeah, that's correct. So we're essentially looking for developers that are already building out projects that may be intended for a PPA or toll to offer those projects to us as a turnkey purchase that we could make just prior to COD. So we're putting all of the obligations on permitting, interconnection, equipment selection, construction on the developer. But within the build transfer agreements, we would have oversight rights, consent rights, and the ability to provide feedback associated with decision making along the way to protect our interests.
Thank you.
Is there still a kind of high level framework of thinking about comparing the economic opportunity of this mechanism against a prepayment? Or is that
Yes.
kind of secondary? Okay.
Yeah, so that would be part of what we would bring to the board when we make the shore listing recommendation, is to identify how much of a savings might we be looking at by going down the build transfer route as opposed to the competing tolling agreements for those same technologies. So this would stack standalone storage against standalone storage, solar plus storage against solar plus storage under both approaches, and help inform ultimately, do we wish to move forward with any build transfers? And if so, which projects do we wish to move forward with under those constructs?
I think that's great. And my wish list item, if it's possible, is to also understand a little bit about the sensitivity to the interest rate environment we're in at the time. And maybe look at that comparison over a 10+ year time frame, as opposed to just a first bite at a PPA prepayment cost structure. So that might get into the weeds a little, but if we can think about that general comparison as opposed to in an opportunistic rate environment, and think about it more generally, that would be very intriguing. So that's wish list, and if that's not reasonable, that's fine.
Yeah, I think that should be quite doable as like a sensitivity on the build transfer valuations that we would get done.
Thank you. Any other questions for this part? Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Philippe. Appreciate it, and good work. It's good to see all this moving forward. So up next, we have what I hope is a lively discussion, and we wanted to close the loop with you on what we're seeing as a proposed or sort of highly informed 24 to 25 work plan, and then accompanying our sort of first formal cut of draft budget. And we do expect there'll be iteration here, but the purpose of sharing this today is to have board discussion on it, so that when we come back to the board for approval, we've registered the board's input. So with that, next slide, I'll run you through a bit of background, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So just a quick reminder on the process. We started the year in January, February doing these member interviews and needs assessments. Thank you for those of you who hosted us or met with us. Appreciate it, and appreciate your staff's time and thoughtfulness. Also, as part of that, we sent out surveys that many of you were able to complete, and that, you know, again, in some quantitative fashion, gave us a sense of what your priorities were. Out of that, we've been working and developing work plans. And then now we're entering into the final step of finalizing those work plans, and then establishing a budget and ultimately approving a budget that maps to those work plans. In some cases, our member interviews focused primarily on nearer term, 1 year ahead work flows and work plans, but you know, as part of that, we also wanted to have a sense of what we're building towards. And so at times we drifted into sort of what, you know, how should we be growing this organization? What do you guys want? And we have a little of that sprinkled in here, so I'll talk about that. Next slide. So the large conclusions on the 24-25 priorities were that power supply, power procurement was the main focus area. And when we looked at how we could help, there's a couple themes that surfaced. One was to support and build deal flow that you guys can consider and that your procurement teams can consider. Many of you have robust solicitation teams and your own pipelines, but what we can help with is by providing more deal flow. And so a couple ways that could look like is this build transfer solicitation we're undertaking, including a possible phase 2B where we would actually try to contract on it. Additional RPS procurement, emerging tech explorations, again, through a joint action solicitation, and then continuing down the path of this offshore wind and maybe further exploring offshore wind, including through this MOU implementation. Another major theme was on joint action, mostly related to procurement. And so this would include joint action, but also contract management and administering the contracts we have, and then looking for these master service agreement structures. So themes in this area were RA related projects, scheduling coordinator related work and getting that set up, prepay preparation, potential bulk buys, including of information services like we've done in the past, and then grant pursuits and cost saving actions. So as we mentioned, we might be in a position to, on behalf of members through a joint project, look for grant support. And so Director Marshall, would it make sense to jump in now, or do you want me to finish the slide?
Go ahead and finish. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, another thing is looking at the financial maturation of the CCAs and trying to position us for possible bond issuance and this credit maturation work. While it's not rocket science to issue debt, if we do go down that path, there is a fair amount of work, especially the first time. You're normalizing who we are. You're normalizing the contract structures of the debt issuance. You're educating a lot of parties, and you want to have a robust, effective debt issuance as well. So gearing up for that would be part of the work plan. And then lastly, this drifts a little more into long-term, sort of building the overall in-house capabilities of CC Power. We want skill sets and resources and familiarity in ways that help in the following ways. One is origination, as we've discussed, the financial valuation and analysis piece. And I say it half in jest. Some of you have said, give us our staff back. So we've relied a lot on CC Power members staff to help with financial valuation analysis, which has been great contributions. But building our own skill set there would help all of our members and then be available for you all. More project management skills and the ability to support members just in getting access to resources and feeling educated and informed. RA related support, and then some operations and finance skills and in-house capabilities. So that gives you a quick sense of the priorities, but I want to emphasize, we sifted through your data. We reviewed our notes. We took meticulous notes with all of our interviews with you. In some cases, we had follow-up interviews. So a lot of thinking went into this, and then you'll see it translate into a work plan in the budget. So Director Marshall, can I answer any questions, or would you have any comments at this time?
Yes, thank you so much. Can I ask you please to say a little bit more about what, sort of what is the content behind scheduling coordinator agreement? Sort of what role, and same question related to prepay preparation.
Sure. So that bucket of items includes contract management. So just for our own purposes of managing the existing contracts we have, we do need to get a scheduling coordinator lined up. So that's sort of not relevant for some of you who aren't in the contracts, but as part of that also, we might look at a master services agreement. Now, I know some of you have recently signed deals or contracts with your own scheduling coordinator, so you would not be interested in support in that area. The concept of a master services agreement, however, is that if there are scheduling coordinators who could offer sort of discounts when we approach them with a bulk contract, the MSA structure allows us to contract with them, and then also may allow others to come in and get services under that contract umbrella in a way which might achieve cost savings, but would be optional for members and only if they want it. So
Okay.
that's why I've listed scheduling coordinator agreement in that one because it sort of hits the contract management piece and the master services agreement exploration, but we really don't know who would take us up on that and if we would move forward.
And how about prepay?
Yeah, prepay is another one for our contracts. And as many of you know, we have our geothermal units are a really good fit for prepay. So we know we want to prepay them and we want to be timely with respect to interest rates. The units are not online yet, so you want to get started to position that. We may look at prepays as another type of joint action where we would be prepaying on the deals that are relevant for us, but it may make sense through an advisor's input to group contracts and get the right scale of prepay so you can get the best outcome on the prepay overall. So a good example would be if someone has a solar contract that they haven't prepaid and by itself it's too small for a prepay, maybe we would add that into our portfolio and then do a joint prepay, so to speak, and that could get a better outcome. So again, the prepay is just contract management, but also may have this master services joint action element to it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. Okay, anything else on the sort of high level work priorities we're seeing here? And of course, if we've missed the mark, I always want to know that right away, right? So if you see something really critical missing, chances are it's here, but I may not use the right words, but we'll build from here. So let's go to the next slide. And again, please jump in with any questions. I wanted just as we get into the linkage between work planning and budgeting, I wanted to remind everyone of how CC Power operates. I think you guys are very familiar, but we use these 3 phases. And so phase 1 is really all member access. That's where we're doing these strategic assessments. We work a lot with the working groups to check in with your members on if something might be relevant or interesting and worth pursuing. We then go into the pursuit phase, phase 2, which is where we would solicit for services and try to get negotiate an outcome there. We call that phase 2, but you have to opt in. So that's only for interested parties. So we would not know. There's the cost shared, and then materials and information from the phase 2 typically will be restricted just to the participants in appropriate ways. And then lastly, if we do sign on and pursue a contract or execute an agreement, we go into phase 3, which is sort of the ongoing administration and operation of it. As many of you know, our long duration storage and firm clean resource contracts are in phase 3 at this time. Okay. So let's move on next. And so what this next slide is it starts to categorize the work into the phase 1, 2, 3 concept. And this is important because when we budget, work that's done in phase 1 is available for all members. It tends to be what I would call general and administrative costs. So everybody's paying. And we differentiate that from the phase 2 and phase 3 work, which is the project costs, where those participating in the project are more directly allocated costs for that. So in phase 1, we see the strategic assessments for power supply related projects. So we'll continue to do research and evaluation work here. For instance, we may look at alternative technology solicitations, depending on what the resource planning working group wants. We'll look for opportunities there. We may also be working in phase 1 to roadmap how we would get into MSAs and how we would roadmap services and bring that on. If members see enough of a path and interest, it would kick into phase 2. And then, and this will probably be pretty small, but we'll probably do a few assessments on some possible program activities. We don't want to commit significantly to the program work right now, but these assessments tend to be relatively small and they give us a roadmap, and that helps the working groups evaluate if something's worth pursuing or not. In phase 2, we are including the phase 2A. You had an update on that, but we have not invoiced. So phase 2A is really there. And there's the possible phase 2B, which would be going from a short list to actually negotiating and executing any contracts. This prepay work, the offshore wind, we would look at the MSAs and then also look at this RA power pool concept. This came up a lot as something that our member CCAs are really looking at how slice of day affects their RA portfolio. And if the tools in the toolkit give them the right solutions to build an efficient portfolio and transact around that. So we might look at that, but we would roadmap it first. And then expected bulk buys on the information services, again, similar to an R rate report. And then lastly, on phase 3, we'll continue, and I don't say continue because this is one of the most important things, project and contract management on our existing contracts. We'll have these training services and then recurring project execution. And if any of those phase 2 items get executed on, they would, jump over into phase 3 as well. So that gives you a sense of the work by phase. Let me pause for a moment because then we'll start to shift into the budget side. Director Padilla, please go ahead.
I have not looked ahead to see what you're showing, but do you have a sense of the different kind of priorities that you identified in the previous slide? Do you have a sense of when those would be rolled out from a time standpoint? Because the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 could be 2025, 2028. It could. I'm trying to get a sense of what you're trying to roll out and when.
Yeah. So a lot of these would be happening simultaneously here. So we would be working on phase 1. For items that are ready, the board would decide to move it into phase 2. And then for the phase 3 work, that would also be ongoing across the year. So this is sort of work we would be wanting to achieve in 24, 25. If you're suggesting you want to see a little more of like a map of when we would do which first, we can develop that for you. Does that help, Director Padilla? Okay. And Director Padilla, if you see anything that looks a little out of sequence, like we might be getting ahead, let me know, because we'd want to flush that out and make that clear. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's move to the next slide, please. So there's also a whole bunch of other work that doesn't easily map into the phase 1, 2, 3. A board event in the fall, continued external engagement. We may, as part of our resource planning working groups, helping everybody kind of ramp up on possible projects, do site tours and pre-origination work where we're sort of building lines of sight into ideas, and then organizational enhancements. Some of that, as I mentioned before, is just tuning up the HR side of things, having the HR handbook, more basic stuff. So that would be in the organizational enhancements category. And so with that, let's go to the next slide. And so to throw another framework at you, the historical approach for CC Power budgeting has been to break everything down, not by phase per se, but by G&A versus project. And as you know, project tends to reflect phase 2 and phase 3 costs. And so to give you a little map of it, personnel can be mapped to either side, and inside our budget, we look at every line item and we actually try to approximate how much of that line item should flow to G&A versus to project. And so you can get quite technical in terms of how you allocate costs. And we are ramping up that cost allocation approach significantly this year. Also on G&A is general counsel. So we've tagged general counsel as an administrative function for CC Power that is not and is separate from project costs. If our general counsel has to work on the project, we can kind of track those costs separately. Any other G&A applicable costs hit here, and then the reserve building costs are G&A. By contrast, on the project side, again, we may have some personnel costs there, or a significant amount of personnel costs, and then project specific direct costs, which we can try to predict, and then project specific overheads. So as I mentioned, one thing that's a significant change for this year in the budget you'll see proposed and draft budget you'll see today is that rather than not tell you what the phase 2 and 3 costs might be, we've tried to anticipate and forecast phase 2 costs within reason and include that in the budget. So if you call a budget a work plan, we try to embed and give you a signal of what those costs would be. That said, we know that the budget does not prejudge that there still needs to be board decisions on whether to pursue phase 2 and phase 3 projects. So you'll see a budget that has all of the potential phase 2 and 3 work that we've contemplated represented in it, but there would be gateways and go, no go decisions for the board before we would start spending some of that money. So I'll speak to that a little bit more. And then one other thing on the project side, we call the project a balancing account. So that's where we hold your money and we track it specifically for your CCA, depending on what projects you're participating in. And every quarter we have a sense of how much of your project specific funds were used. And this is one of the last years where we won't have large revenues coming in also on the project side, because once those projects are in the CAISO market, have even more complicated accounting. So let me pause there, and then I'll move on to another more granular look at the budget.
So Jim, Morris, I think your comment about the pulling the trigger on a number of these items being a future board action is critical. I think that helps me quite a bit, because I think we're adopting or we're looking at a draft budget that anticipates that is probably mildly optimistic in terms of our success, and I think that's smart, because I think the fewer budget adjustments you can request during the year, the better, from a management standpoint. But that helps to have those checkpoints. So I appreciate that. Are there any other questions at this point before we go into the details? I'm not seeing any hands, so why don't we go ahead and dive in?
Okay, yeah, and I just want to emphasize, we have had feedback that mid-year asks can be challenging for some of our members. And so what we're trying to do with this draft budget is we're trying to be clear on the front end what we think the spending might be. But as you indicated, Chair Seifert, there's still check-ins with the board before money gets spent generally, but we're sort of placeholdering it for everybody's simplicity in budgeting. All right, so here's a rack up of the budget really quick. Next slide. It is where we land is with a preliminary budget of 6.2 million. There's actually a kind of good story here, because that 6.2 is built on 1.2 G&A and then a lot of projects. So a lot of project is kind of a good sign, because that would be things you've opted in, you saw value for, and it's a sign that we're executing on our mission of joint action. You're starting to get really the tangible benefits and solutions you want from CC Power. So when you see the project side grow, that's a sign there's more project activity happening. Just to note on the G&A side, we're trying to keep that small, and it still currently does include 175K in line with our reserve building goals. So we are still in the early stage of CC Power, where we're trying to build a healthy but modest set of reserves, and so everybody's addressing that through G&A. And then a little more on the project side, there's that 5 million number. One thing it does include, though, is it includes the invoices for the phase 2A project. So as many of you know, the board approved that in January, and we've started that work. We actually haven't invoiced you for it. So rather than invoice you mid-cycle, what we're proposing to do here is just collect that money and invoice you through the annual budget allocation. So that would be in July. So that's 440K, not to exceed. And then we've already detailed some of what's in the phase 2 and phase 3 work plans. A good example of that is the build transfer phase 2B. So we don't know if we'll do the phase 2B yet. We're researching it. We're going to solicit for bids. The board will have opportunities to decide, but we are including expected rough costs for a BTA phase 2B, so that you're aware and planning ahead of time on the cost implications of that. And then lastly, on the project side, expanding CC Power's capabilities through a few expanded FTEs, and I'll speak to that. So next slide. I wanted to just give you a bit of context on this budget compared to past budgets. So budgeting here is, I'd say, significantly more detailed than in the past. In 2022, CC Power was really just getting started, had a $1.1 million budget and an even split between G&A and project. There were mid-year asks that are not shown here, but that was, my understanding was that was disruptive at the time. So in 2023, we ended up with about a $1.8 million budget, and then some mid-year asks again to the tune of about $600,000 for a total of 2.4 million. And then now we're trying to really embed and pre-plan what the project budget should be. So in 2024, as indicated, you see the 6.2 million split by 1.2 and 5. I see some questions, so this is great. Let's have a little discussion. Director Hale, I believe you were first, and then Director Shaw, please.
Thank you. I am interested in understanding the project budget increases and how they are distributed across the different phases and different projects, please.
Absolutely. So that is the right question to ask, Director Hale. So how do we allocate projects when we don't always know who's participating yet? A fair bit of work has gone into thinking about project cost allocation. To give you a sense of it, some of you are participating in projects now. So we know who the project participants are. So what we do is we estimate the total amount of project work, and then that creates this total pot of money. Some of those direct costs are assigned directly to that project, which then flows directly to the CCAs involved in that project. For instance, if you were involved in one of our firm clean resource projects, we have anticipated some element of spending associated directly with that project. And those costs are assigned to that project bucket, which then flows based on your project share to the CCA there. So some of you who may see higher forecasted project costs, that probably means you're a large participant in existing projects. By contrast, Director Hale, the build transfer phase 2B is a projected project. We don't know who would participate. So we have a couple different methodologies for allocating costs or expected costs in that instance. We can allocate it based on your load share. So we might assume that larger entities would take a larger share of a BTA phase 2B, or we can allocate it pro rata. So we look at each one of these potential costs and we make a judgment call on how to allocate. We will be wrong, but the good news though is that all that money sits in a balancing account. So if we over collect from you a little bit, it rolls forward and you get your money back. And if we under collect a little bit, we can tune that up later. So that's the key to having the balancing account, is that a lot of this is a forecasted spending plan. And then as we adjust, we make sure that everyone's held whole and their money's tracked and retained and available for them. So hopefully I answered your question. Any follow-ups, Director Hale?
Yeah, so it's helpful to get that sort of basic approach. I'd like to see the actual data.
Okay, and I'm happy to walk you through it, and it'll be fun. I like walking through the spreadsheet, so I appreciate that, and I appreciate your time in advance.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Director Shaw, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, General Manager Morris. If I'm looking at slide 3 correctly, to date, we're underperforming in a number of the project-specific budget to year-to-date expense. So there's project-specific dollars that the members have been invoiced for that CC Power's holding, but is not spending out.
Correct.
And that's because of the status of various projects and so on.
Correct.
So I'm curious if as you move forward and you're anticipating additional project budget participation and invoicing CCAs, the members early for that, is there a different holding account that CC Power has to address potentially accrued interest and other things on those dollars that are being held? Because as we grow and anticipate more project, that's more operational dollars that are being held by CC Power.
Great question. Absolutely, Director Shaw. So we track by CCA how much of your project account funds we have. This year, we made the determination with our accountant that the interest rate tracking was not material yet, but we have teed that up for next year as something we want to track interest and accrue interest and then flow it properly to the CCA's balancing account that has, we're sitting on their money. And we also have talked about how do we return the money if we end up not using it. Would it be easier for you all if we invoice you for the full amount and then we write you a check back for any extra? Or do you want us to reduce your invoice amount if we're sitting on some of your extra money? So these are sort of implementation practices. I've also reached out to other similarly situated agencies like CC Power. So the municipal world has agencies similar to CC Power, and have been trying to set up some accounting discussions with them to get best practices and lessons learned through their many decades of operation. So those are still some outstanding questions, and what I would propose we do is I welcome feedback, and then most likely I'll work with Treasurer Sears on strategizing how we do that and what we notify the board about. And there'll be chances to course correct as we go.
I appreciate that,
Yeah.
General Manager Morris. I'm glad that you're thinking about those things and you'll be engaging the treasurer in moving forward and thinking about those things. It is tough, I think, when I look at slide 3 and we think of outperforming, like we always want to be under budget, but this is one of those areas where being on budget is more important and variance from budget is bad, whether it's up or down. So just robust planning and thinking through that question of how that float of those dollars as they become significant gets addressed from the accounting is important.
Yeah, very well said. I agree. And having just, racked up the finances for year to date, I have also had observed that some of our estimates were inaccurate. And so, one other just quick closing the loop there, Director Shaw, is with the help of our accountant, based on best practices, we are changing a few of the names of the categories. So last year, or in the current year, we've had this category called project flow-throughs. We did that because we wanted it to be clear this was sort of project execution dollars, but instead what we're finding is that's not really a normal accounting label. And so instead we're going to account in these new labels, but then we'll give you your project specific balancing account. So you'll always get the information you need, but we're still going to be more GAAP compliant just in the language we use. Okay. Great, thank you, and I welcome further questions. Director Padilla.
Yeah, interested to understand a little bit more about how you intend to, I guess, roll out this significant increase in FTEs, 5.25 in 1 year. How are you going to allocate them between G&A versus projects? How are you going to allocate them to projects if you don't know what projects we have or who's going to be participating in the projects? And did you look at alternatives, including additional sweat equity by the participant and the members, and are just using consultants? Because I worry that once we start to build up this staff infrastructure, you can't really roll it back as easily. And so, going from 2 to 7.25 in 1 year without a really clear understanding of what they're going to work on, I would have a hard time defending that and the budget that would correspond for SVCE.
Yeah, understood. That's great input, Director Padilla. The next slide actually speaks to that, but I'll share a little bit about how we've wrestled with that. That has come up a lot in our work planning, which is right. What are the right ways to build the capabilities we want CC Power to have? Should we invest in resources we control? Should we use consultants? We've looked a lot at different structures, and what you see in that 5.25 FTE increase, which I should say draft 5.25 FTE increase, is what we're sort of loosely calling minimal sufficiency. And one of the key challenges we're working on is that our experience is that when you hire a new FTE, they may not be ready to deliver immediate value. And that's a challenge. And so as we ramp up the work, we may, in the right circumstances, want to hire a little bit in advance of that so people have time to settle in. Or as you said, we can try to hire mid-career people or consultants, those who are positioned better to do the work. So more immediately, I should say. So we are looking at that, and I'd say where we landed with the 5.25 increase is it's feels right to me, and a lot of it is sort of loaded into the project execution and the power supply area. So we know that really targets what the members have predominantly indicated they want. but you'll see there's a little bit more building as well. And so we can go to the next slide unless there are additional questions, or Director Padilla, if you want me to stay on this slide, I'm happy to. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So FTE considerations, great question, Director Padilla, right? Is this prudent? And so where we landed, again, thematically, was that what the members want is more power supply and origination support and capability. So we focused a lot on that. And as you know, we have Director Philippe Gerritsen already in that position. And so to flesh out that area a little more, we wanted to get an analyst and 2 project managers. So that analyst will really help with the evaluation. And the topic of sweat equity is a really good one, because a large theme we've heard feedback on was people want their staff back. And so we should be investing, whether it's FTEs or consultants, in having our own capabilities, so we're not leaning on members, staff as much. And so having our own analyst, and then having project managers to work on the origination, or perhaps on this RA power pool, and a few of the other sort of phase 2, phase 3 projects, seems very appropriate and warranted. There's some additional FTEs though that are more in the building category. One is operations. So as we add projects, there needs to be more linkages to your staff, more data sharing and information, more collaboration with your staff through the working groups. So the operations staffer is designed to help just operate CC Power. As many of you know, we've also hired Martha Sirians to help with our file sharing. And when you start file sharing in line with Cal CCA's approach, you end up having to manage the permissions a lot, even though that is an effective approach. We're staffing up for that here. On the finance side, when we suggest finance, it's not an extremely high-ranking finance person we're envisioning. What it is more of a mid-level finance person who's going to help project manage some of the prepays, and would have visibility to some of the debt issuance work if we pursue it, the phase 2AB. And so would be in a position then to help oversee the finance and settlements support services we would have once projects are up and running. So it seemed like that finance staffer really hit a few areas we know are coming, and it seemed prudent. But at the same time, we didn't want to hire in a way that's so senior that, because we don't need that level of skill just yet. We're hiring for the Goldilocks level and let that person build skills as we go and as things get more complicated. And then lastly, building for the future is the data staff. Now, this is hard to summarize because CCAs use data in many ways. And one thing we found, though, is that building and incubating capability with data could be very valuable to the CCAs across time. Now, this person originally could ride along, build a few ideas for how we serve data just for our members, and then we could look at longer term solutions with that staffer in mind. Some of these staff are not envisioned to be brought in immediately. So budget wise, in our budget, we roughly project when would we hire them. Is this 100% of the year, 50% of the year, 75% of the year? And that's why you see that 5.25% number. So a few of these positions are expected to be lagged and brought in maybe mid-year. And those are things we can tune a little bit too as we sharpen the budget for any eventual approval. So I've spoken a lot, Director Padilla. Did you have any questions or follow-up at this time, specifically on the FTE, or anything you want us to further scrutinize before we come back to the board?
Yeah, there's a dollar amount, 5 million, that I think is an increase from that you're assigning to projects in this fiscal year 24-25. How much of that 5 million is associated with staff versus, I guess, consultants and lawyers or something else? It's not staff, all staff. The 5 million.
Yeah, it's definitely not all staff. So if we go up to the previous slide, you see in the bottom right there, the project budget. So that's really the phase 2 phase work. 2.9 million is direct costs. So really what that means is those are placeholders for consultants. So of the 5 million, you know that about 3 million is sort of direct costs. There's more to it than that. So this is highly oversimplified, and we tried to aggregate the information to be useful. But I think what you're also interested in, how much of the new FTE load would be hitting that project side budget. Am I correct? So we can try to distill that further for you. And hopefully that'll, and you can even get as specific as each FTE. Which one are they hitting? So for instance, the operations FTE, is split across project and G&A, because we know that person's going to be helping just administer the working groups, which is a G&A side function, versus tuning up the file sharing for project participants, which is specific for projects. So each one of these line items, we try to extrapolate which side of the budget it should hit. And I can provide all that information to you. And again, this is a draft proposal, so I do expect we'll iterate and tune things over the next month.
I think, so Director Hale, is this relevant to this one, or is this a new topic? Okay, go ahead.
Relevant to this, I was just going to say, I have a lot of the same questions, and that's why I was asking for the detail. And I appreciate, GM Morris, that you're going to sit down with us. And I would offer to Director Padilla, if you'd like to do a joint meeting, I'm happy to do the scheduling on that. I see a thumbs up. We'll work on that. Thank you.
That's super. And then I'll suggest, Jim Morris, I think you're close to the end of your deck. It might be a good time to wrap up your presentation so that we can get remaining questions all at once.
Great. Yeah, so let's go through the next couple of slides. Scroll down, next one, please. So here's kind of where the rubber meets the road. And again, I caveat, this is draft. This is what the budget model has shown. Okay, so what it shows is G&A lands evenly split across 9 members at $132K per member. And then project participation can vary quite a bit. And a lot of it really depends on your exposure to projects and costs associated and tagged with that project. So on the high end, you see numbers in the 800. On the low end, you see down in the 200s. So you see your totals in the 4th column there for 24-25 draft budget. And to give you a sense of it, we also included the 23-24 information so you can see what's changing and how big a change it is. And I think this is a great time to wrap up, because this is the sort of preliminary draft budget. We are expecting to check in with everybody. And this is also your first chance as a board to see kind of what the work plan is. So we know that there's linkages there. And as we tune things over the next month, we'll hopefully be in a position to come back to the board with everybody ready for and understanding it sufficiently for approval. So next slide is the final slide. Some feedback we're looking for is, does the work plan seem appropriate and in line with the longer term goals or functionalities for CC Power? Is budgeting for phase 2 projects helpful? So do you want us to include these expected costs or not? And then the next steps would be further tuning. We'll also be continuing to vet our cost estimates more, and then as appropriate, finalization and board approval. I did also get the action items, so I'll sit down with Directors Padilla and Hale and any others who are interested. And so that's a good time for discussion. Director Sears, please kick it off.
Sure. Thanks, General Manager Morris. And I would say to other board members or other directors, I should say, that it has been helpful to sit down and see the detail that General Manager Morris is offering to provide. My general impression at this point is that we're obviously in a building phase for this organization, and it's important to get these details right. This is a pretty critical budget, I think, this year in particular. And so I think that the care that Alex and the CC Power team have put into this is showing. I suspect that there's going to be lingering questions about how this is all organized and ultimately what the splits are. But I do appreciate the work that he's put in at this point. And again, I think the more times that I've seen it, the more sort of the logic comes through. And keeping in mind the work plan that we've put in front of him, this really maps back to that pretty closely. So I just wanted to make those general comments.
Yeah, thanks, Director Sears, and thank you for your time. So he's already had 2 headache-inducing reviews of the complicated spreadsheet. So thanks for serving as our treasurer, Director Sears.
Yeah, Director Mitchell.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks so much for the presentation, Alex. I too am very supportive of this. I've also had the benefit of hearing it a little bit in advance. And I think it's really important for CCA Power to grow and be able to execute well on the contracts that we have. And I think this puts us on a really good path to be able to do that. So just really appreciate all the hard work here.
Thank you.
Director Mitchell.
One request that I've got is when you bring the proposal for adoption is to maybe bring a little bit of the narrative around how your specific staff additions don't just fulfill the concrete role that you've put them in, the departments that they're in, but also could facilitate supporting our strategic plan and some of the future initiatives. Because I think that future potential is something we're all kind of hungry for, is understanding what else we might be doing. So that's my request. And then I'll turn to Director Marshall.
Thank you. Director Cyphers, I would agree. I would like to join the meeting with Director Hale and Padilla, if you don't mind, to understand this better, because one of the things that we talk about internally is just making sure that across both CC Power and Cal CCA, that we are not duplicating costs relative to talent and, staffing, right? And it's a huge, there is some natural overlap, which makes sense, but just really wanting to understand so that we can help justify in our upcoming budget season and to our board, why it's important to continue on with these kinds of increases. So with that, I don't have any other comment because I don't know yet, but I would like to join the meeting. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent. And General Counsel Isles, I know you'll caution us to avoid.
That's where I was about to go. Yep. So 3 sounds great. How about leave it there?
Okay.
All right, Director.
Yeah, I was just about to raise my hand. I'll work with you, General Manager Morris, and any board members to facilitate that.
Yeah, just appreciate the presentation and the patience you're all having with me. Obviously, this is my first time seeing this, and I hadn't been really a part of budgets in the past, maybe just the very first one when we started, but definitely echo what Director Marshall said, and not just Cal CCA overlap or CC Power, but also with our own staffs, because I know at my agency, we're developing a lot of these expertise and have invested quite a bit in staff and training and development. And so I want to make sure that I'm not duplicating efforts somewhere else. Or if I am, to be aware of that and maybe back off on some of the stuff I'm doing in-house so that we can really just kind of leverage each other. So really interested to see the details and see how it fits with our strategic plan here at SBCE and how we can most effectively carry out our mission as well. Other than that, thank you.
Yeah, if I may, Director Cyphers, just want to say thanks, Director Padilla. Really appreciate a lot of the perspectives you've shared. I know you have a lot of experience with joint action agencies, so that's been really helpful for us as we try to land with the right model of resourcing. And I do expect we'll tune this a little bit. So appreciate everybody's listening and input.
We've got a good half hour on this item. Are there any further kind of critical input from the board before we go to the public? Not seeing hands. Okay, great. So let's turn to the public, and I want to give you a chance to raise your hands if anybody from the public wishes to comment on the general manager's report. And again, this has 3 elements: the build own transfer, the preliminary work plan and budget, and a financials update. So you can use the raise hand feature if you wish to speak. I'm not seeing any, and I know I can trust our team to tell me if we've gotten any email comments, and I'm not seeing those hands raised. Okay, so let's go to item 6B, and this is an item for action on some policies and roles and responsibilities. So you want to kick this off, GM Morris?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. So backstory here was that, CC Power is still young. These policies help provide board guidance to us as we pursue day-to-day activities. And so we've been coming to you at virtually every meeting this year with some policies for approval. So here's the latest one is on roles and responsibilities. Now, the term roles and responsibilities doesn't express everything that's in the policy. So there was a couple things we wanted to do in terms of policy solving that would help us here. And we bundled it with the help of General Counsel Isles into this roles and responsibilities policy. So first is we wanted to have a good actor code of conduct for all members so that we can appropriately discuss matters and know that confidentiality is going to be addressed. So we loosely refer to that as this good actor code of conduct. But then we wanted to more specifically lay out specifically how we'll protect information. And so the policy, which is this roles and responsibilities policy, also includes good actor responsibilities around information protection. And so I think that tees it up. And so I'd like General Counsel Isle to please offer any sort of further level of detail and draw the board's attention to anything critical. And then we would like discussion if possible, please, Director Cyphers.
Yeah, so thanks. I think that was a good overview of the purpose of the policy. I think it just sets general expectations for how CC Power staff will act. But then again, best practices for CC Power members as they're participating in the furtherance of CC Power's goal. And also ensuring that there is helpful information sharing without kind of contradicting any state or federal laws. So our main goal is there. And we did share this with member staff, and we did ask for feedback, and we did receive some feedback from member council as well. So did want to know that was circulated, I think March 22nd. And like I said, we did receive some feedback, and we are working. Another portion of this policy is this membership participation agreement that will also directly go through member staff and member council as well.
Thank you. So let's turn and see if there are any questions or input. Sure, Director Padilla.
You're all gonna wish you never added me to your board. I'm known to ask a lot of questions.
I can't imagine that would be the truth, but go ahead.
Meetings much longer. I did review the policy. Thank you so much for providing that, General Manager Morris. Did have a question on the section 2, however, and as it relates to getting consent, I guess, to use confidential information. And the way that I translate that into English is that once a CC Power solicitation and procurement effort is done, you've closed your RFO, you've shortlisted or negotiated, executed contracts. Those offers that were made into that solicitation are essentially fair game, right? Is that what I'm understanding?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Perhaps more specifically, we were guarding against the pre-signing of the deal where we want everybody operating in good faith inside the tent there so that no one works around CC Power to pursue a deal on their own. So that's really the good actor code of conduct. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. So I guess maybe just to make sure that it's very clear to all the participants, will CC Power make some kind of declaration or say, hey, our containment of these offers is done. You're all free to do what you need to do to pursue your own procurement. Or am I, as a member of a phase 2, supposed to go to each member and say, are you okay releasing this information? Or how will that be carried out? Because it wasn't clear on the policy how it actually works.
Yeah, that's a really important execution detail. The language we used for everybody's benefit was this wording, information gained through their members should not use confidential or otherwise non-public information gained through their participation in CC Power to pursue deals that are actively considered for CC Power. So it's sort of the active consideration. How do we declare the end of active consideration is kind of how I interpret your question, Director Padilla. General Counsel Isles, I do think she raises a great point. We need to sort of make sure that members know what the expectations are and don't run afoul of anything. And I would believe it would be beneficial if we could sort of tell everyone we're done. This rule is kind of complete here. What's your quick legal input on that, General Counsel?
Yeah, to step it back a bit, just as a reminder, this is a CC Power policy that's being adopted by the CC Power board. So I very much see this as providing direction to CC Power staff. The members are not signing on to this policy. So this is providing guidance and expectations for best practices. What we're really using as the vehicle for members to actually sign on is this membership participation agreement, and that will have a lot more specifics. Like I said, it'll be reviewed by council. And so that agreement would be what kind of has a specific language around what exactly constitutes.
I might suggest, though, Director Padilla raises a really nice point, and I might suggest that separate and apart from this action today, that the board could direct staff to formalize when the phase of a project transitions, and do that through an email communication or something in writing so that we have that notice. And I think unless there's an objection of the board, I don't think that requires an action of the board to just request that staff do that in process. And then if it does require an action, we could bring that to a future meeting. Does that generally resonate with members, that be clarified?
Yeah, and General Counsel Isles, I did understand this to be a policy that the board would adopt, but it does have an obligation on members as well. And so that's what I want to make sure that I, as a member, also understand the rules. So I think I second what Director Cyphers has suggested. I think that's really all I'm asking for here.
Okay, and we can hear in the future if it requires an action, but I think for the moment that could be an informal request from the board. So let's see, I see Director Shaw first, and then we'll go to Hale.
Sorry, Chair Cyphers. I was just going to agree with you and but I think that's the approach we've taken before. Like when there are RFOs, we shortlist and then release the RFO. And I think that's how we've handled those with others. So I think that's consistent with what you're sort of laying out. And as long as staff can administer the policy in a way that's clear for everyone, I think that should address those issues.
Okay, thanks. Director Hale.
Thank you. Yes, I agree with the discussion that has happened so far. Thank you for asking the question, Director Padilla. And I think everyone getting information at the same time about when the release has occurred is important, especially as the market plays out the way it has been. The other thing I wanted to flag separately for San Francisco, and our general counsel may have some insight on this, the references to the Public Records Act and such are important, and the Brown Act are important. San Francisco also has its own sunshine ordinance that addresses disclosure of public records. And it's not mentioned here. It may not need to be, but I just feel like since this is listing member obligations as well as CC Power obligations, just want to flag for all of you, don't forget, I have different obligations. And I don't know, General Counsel Isles, whether there's any need to make a modification to the materials to reflect that, but I did feel it's important to flag it for folks.
Yeah, thank you. And that is something that has been included in previous CC Power agreements. So yeah, I absolutely think that we can include it here and still keep this in substantially the same form. So we can make sure that's included.
Is there any further discussion on this before I ask for public comment? Okay, let's turn to public comment. So is there any public comment on item 6B, approval of California Community Power Policies, Roles and Responsibilities Policy? Two policies. Just one policy, but twice the word is used. I am not seeing hands raised. So bring it back, and it sounds like we're looking for a motion that acknowledges that the policy would be adopted in substantially the same form, but with direction to council that could accommodate San Francisco's sunshine ordinance. Is that a fair? I'm seeing some heads nod. Okay, so I'll turn to you. Well, is there a motion?
I
All
move
on the
approval.
floor. All right.
My
so
first,
Sally-
my first motion.
all
I
right.
second.
And just to be clear, was my verbal representation of your motion fair? Okay.
Yes.
All right, and then I got a second from San Francisco. So let's call the roll.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For resolution 240401, Ava Community Energy is absent. Central Coast Community Energy,
Yes.
Clean Power SF,
Yes,
Peninsula Clean Energy,
Yes.
Redwood Coast Energy Authority is absent. San Jose Clean Energy,
Yes.
Silicon Valley Clean Energy,
Yes.
Sonoma Clean Power Authority,
Yes.
and Valley Clean Energy.
Yes.
Thank you. The resolution passes.
Well, thank you very much. That concludes our regular business. And so I'll turn to any individual member items. Any announcements? Well, I'll have one. We're turning 10 years old next week. So we're going to have our little 10-year party. And for the few of you who were at the Cal CCA event and helped celebrate us, thank you for coming. And I'm excited about that. Anyone
Congratulations.
else? Thanks.
Congratulations. Onward.
Yeah, congratulations. Huge milestone.
I think the
Congratulations.
club's going to grow pretty soon. I think the club's going to get really big in about 3 years. So, all right. I'm not seeing other hands raised, so I'm going to adjourn the meeting at 2:37 p.m. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, directors. Appreciate